Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's talk on disability sports, which is part of DMU's UK Disability History Month programme. I'm Katharine Short, manager of the university's Special Collections held in the library. Special Collections includes archives, artefacts and rare books, and we have a special focus on collecting archives relating to sports history in partnership with the International Centre for Sports History and Culture here at DMU. Our holdings include local clubs such as the Leicester Tigers Rugby Club and the Leicester Riders Basketball Club, as well as national organisations such as England Boxing, the Ski Club of Great Britain, and the English Chess Federation. We're interested in holdings that showcase the diversity of sporting activity, including access to sports for disabled people. The aim of today's talk is to highlight some resources available for anyone interested in exploring this history. We're delighted to welcome two guest speakers today. Up first is Dr. Susan Barton, an honorary research fellow at the International Centre for Sports History and Culture. She has a wide range of research interests, and publications include work on Leicester local history, tourism, and winter sports. In 2009, Sue was researcher and co-author of a report, Learning Disability, Sport and Legacy, which examines the holding of the Special Olympics National Summer Games in Leicester. Special Collections holds papers relating to the organisation of this Special Olympics, as well as Sue's research notes, and her talk will consider the legacy of the Games. Following Sue will be Vicky Hope-Walker, Chief Executive of the National Paralympic Heritage Trust. Vicky has been working in the heritage, tourism and arts sectors for 30 years and has been involved with the Paralympic Heritage Trust since 2014. The Trust has established an archive and visitor centre, and Vicki will introduce us to their collections and their vision for documenting the Paralympics. After the presentations, we should have time for some questions. Please put these into the chat bar and we'll come to them at the end. Let me now hand over to Dr. Susan Barton. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to be talking about Special Olympics using information that I gathered from the Special Olympics National Summer Games, which were held in Leicester in 2009. And this was the second time that the Games had been held in Leicester. I'm going to have a look to start off with some of the histories of the Games and the background to it and how it came about, and then go on to look at the impact of the Games on those that took part, who are known as Special Olympics athletes, and their families. So it will go on to look at the social legacies and soft legacies of the Games. The Special Olympics movement began in 1968 in Chicago at Soldier Field, but its origins go back to the early 1960s when Eunice Kennedy Shriver opened up the garden of her home for sporting camps for children with learning disabilities, or intellectual disabilities as the term that was used in the USA. It took another decade for Special Olympics to come to Britain. It started here when Gloucester swimming coach Chris Maloney began teaching a boy with Down syndrome, and then developed swimming groups for other children with learning disabilities. He contacted Mrs. Rose Kennedy, who passed his letter on to her daughter Eunice. And it's quite unbelievable that even in the 1970s, there were no classes that focused on the needs of people with learning disabilities to learn to swim and so on. With the encouragement of the Kennedys and the contacts that they were able to provide in Britain, Chris was able to create a national organisation providing all year round sports training for people with learning disabilities. And this was the Special Olympics UK, which later became Special Olympics GB, because the organisation did not include Northern Ireland, which has always been included as part of a united Ireland, which again is probably due to the Kennedys' influence. The slide I've put on the screen gives some information about how many people were involved in Special Olympics when it was held in Leicester. In 2009, there were 19 Special Olympic regions represented, 2,700 athletes, 1,200 sports coaches, 6,000 family members and supporters, lots of volunteers, and it was a multi-sport activity. So there were 21 sports in the same number of venues with a budget of around £2 million. In the UK, or Great Britain, I should say, the first National Special Olympic Games took place in Knowsley in 1982, and the Games have taken place every 4 years ever since, apart from in 1989 when the Leicester Games were held after only a 3-year break because there'd been a European Games held in Scotland in the following summer. So Special Olympics had become international. Special Olympics GB is a charity run mostly by volunteers, but in 2010 there was a paid staff of 7. I'm not sure how many people are employed at the moment. Only a tiny proportion of the total number of people with learning disabilities in the UK or Great Britain are involved. So it's estimated that in the UK as a whole, there are 1.5 million people with learning disabilities. And on mainland Britain, 1.2 million, and that's the area that's covered by Special Olympics GB. And you can see here that because it's volunteer organised and led, there's a huge disparity in the different sizes of delegations. The delegations are the number of teams that take part in the national games. So there's a huge number of people from the West Midlands, and then comparatively very few if you look from London, where you would expect there to be a high level of provision. But that is to do not just with the number of volunteers, but the problems of negotiating transport across London for people with learning disabilities to be able to get to and from training. Going to look at the social context of the Games and the soft legacy. It uses facilities which already exist, so existing swimming pools, sports centres, leisure centres, parks. So there are no hard legacies, no new infrastructure or facilities are created or provided for the events. The Legacy Project showed that the lasting effects of being involved in Special Olympics, though, go way beyond the transient emotions of running in a race or taking part in a match. Interviews with people with learning disabilities and their families showed that for this group of people, making friendships and relationships is particularly difficult. A survey of lifestyles in an evaluation called Valuing People by Emerson et al. In 2005 showed that for those with learning disabilities, social isolation was a major feature of their lives. The study found 31% of people said they had no contact with friends. 69% said that their friends also had intellectual disabilities. 43% said they'd been bullied, and 19% of those who were living away from home never saw their families. And other studies have estimated that 30% of those with learning disabilities have no non-disabled friends other than those that are paid to provide a service for them. One of the things which made Special Olympics successful in its early days was the way that they were able to involve celebrities, which gained media and public interest, because without that, nobody would have known about it. And because it depends on volunteers and donations, that was something that was important. And having those celebrities, it meant that they were able to generate more interest at local and national government level to get support. So just have a look. That was the C on there. I think that's Kevin Keegan at the first National Games in 1982. And Leicester 1989. And at the early days, the Games raised the awareness not just within the mainstream society and communities. It was also important to raise awareness of the opportunities within the learning disabled communities. As I've said, that the isolation was a problem which was described by nearly everybody that we spoke to involved, both families and the athletes. So the Games themselves raise awareness of what people with learning disabilities can achieve, and that there are organisations that could provide sporting opportunities for them to take part in. I was also an ambassador. You can see him here with both one of the former athletes and a celebrity, Engelbert Humperdinck, which shows again we were able to go out into communities and talk about learning disability in sport, to promote the game, encourage people to come as volunteers, and also just to come as spectators. So this is what I was just talking about before I interrupted and went back to look at those other slides about the background and context. Here we're looking at the social context, and these are the statistics which demonstrate how people can be isolated through their disability. And you'll find that this contrasts sharply with the responses to a survey among athletes and families who came to the Leicester Special Olympics Great Britain National Games. For instance, one of them said, "It's very important. It helps those less fortunate get an opportunity to participate and make new friends. A fantastic concept." Another parent said, "His week is structured around Special Olympics and he's part of a social network when many others could not include him." Another, "In our family, before we became involved with Special Olympics, our son could not or did not want to leave the safety of the house because of the verbal bullying and abuse from other residents, both from adults and children. Now, since winning his first medal, he goes out with his head held high, even with the verbal bullying. And it's because of Special Olympics that he's able to hold his head high, and he has also made friends within Special Olympics. And we, his family, also have several new friends. And the fun and companionship, support for each other, and pride and pleasure in achievement is an experience some of them rarely get in their everyday lives." It's not just the athletes who benefit socially. Families of people with disabilities too often feel isolated and vulnerable themselves. Special Olympics can play an important role in their lives. For instance, one said, "Competing against people of a similar ability lets families know that they're not alone in having a disabled child." Another parent said, "I think it's very important for the self-esteem of the athletes involved, and a fantastic experience for them and their families. Gives them an opportunity to compete with others, makes them realise they're not alone in their problems." And another, "To have the opportunity to live in a community where everyone's tolerant and supportive of each other was a very special experience that we'll not forget. It brought confidence in the athletes and a friendship between parents who are often isolated and deprived of adult-friendly company." Another important effect of being involved in Special Olympics for the athletes that is beyond sport is the promotion of independence and skills development. Being an athlete can involve a lot of organisation as well as commitment. Many people with learning disabilities live at home and so can lack opportunities to develop independence. Others live in care homes where opportunities can be equally lacking. Special Olympics can provide a motivation for independent organisation. For instance, an athlete interviewed by myself travels to swimming training alone on a bus into Leicester city centre from an outlying village, and then catches another bus out to another village where the pool is in which he trains. The same athlete is part of the East Midlands Special Olympics Regional Committee. To get to meetings of this group, he gets a bus from his village to Leicester. Here he meets another athlete on the committee. They cross town to the railway station, where they get a train to a county town, and from here they get a taxi to the meeting. This determination is typical of many Special Olympics athletes. A bowls player told how proud he was when he managed to get 2 buses on his own to practice when his taxi was cancelled. Of being at the Games, one parent said, "It is so important for morale and independence. It's a great experience." A mother described how her son has, through a love of Special Olympics football, taught himself enough reading skills to be able to get the related information. He's also learned more subtle concepts like how to follow rules, how to relate to others and control reactions to them. He's learned how to cope with losing. He has his self-esteem boosted by finding things that he can do. For one mother, an important aspect was that for her daughter, social skills and interaction develop. She was given the opportunity to shine and encouraged to compete. Friendships are born, physical skills like balance are also developed. Being in the regional squad and staying away from home for a week facilitates independence and also serves as a rite of passage for some of them to adult life. And one parent said, "This was probably one of the most important events in my son's life to date. He had the joy of being picked, which increased his confidence, the experience of spending a week with other athletes whose whole life centered around the sport he loves, the freedom to be a man without his family, and the ultimate joy of earning a medal to show off to friends and family back home." One of the studies of 2005 showed that around 30% of people with learning disabilities had no friends who were not family members or with a disability or paid to be with them. Special Olympics gives opportunities for athletes, supporters and coaches to develop lasting relationships and deep feelings and deep friendships. For example, coaches and parents organise holidays for athletes in a particular friendship group within a sporting club. In Leicester, one swimming club have been to Ibiza a couple of times on package holidays as a group of friends that includes athletes, parents and volunteers. They go away together because they want to, not because it's their job or charitable. And this offers opportunities for further integration as other tourists see holidaymakers with learning disabilities in bars, on the beach and around the hotels doing normal things. When Special Olympics National Games came to Leicester, it gave the opportunity to raise awareness in the local communities about learning disability. Although the sporting events didn't give rise to much mixing with the public in general, local people in the form of volunteers who worked at the venues were able to meet and be involved with athletes. For many of them, it was the first time that they had encountered people with learning disability, and so it was a two-way process. For the visiting athletes, most from regions less ethnically diverse than Leicester, it was a chance to learn about people from other cultures, and explaining to the athletes about diversity and multiculturalism was part of the preparation for coming to Leicester, for some in the South East region in particular. Sorry about that, I'm getting a bit croaky. Looking at the Healthy Athlete programme. So far, the discussion has focused on things peripheral to sport rather than sporting activities themselves. Training for Special Olympic sports has obvious health and fitness benefits for athletes. These benefits are particularly important as people with learning disabilities are often excluded from mainstream sporting and physical activities, such as just going out for a walk alone or going to a gym, dancing at a nightclub or playing out as children. A nurse volunteer on the Healthy Athletes programme described how the benefits for athletes with Down syndrome are quite noticeable when shaking hands. The firm handshake demonstrates improved muscle tone of athletes compared with the more limp grasp of people with Downs who do not take part in sport. And I forgot to say that connected to each national games, there's something called the Healthy Athlete programme, which is like a fringe or side event where health checks are carried out usually in marquees at the Games Village. So athletes are encouraged to go along and get health checks, which they wouldn't normally get. And De Montfort University provides some of the specialists from the health studies and nursing teams that did some of the examinations and testing with the people with learning disabilities. And it was also important because it's quite difficult for people to get that experience with large numbers of people. So it was a good learning experience for those involved. In 2007, a report by MENCAP with the pessimistic title Death by Indifference highlighted the tragic fact that people with learning disabilities die unnecessarily. They are 4 times more likely to die of a preventable disease and 58 times more likely to die before the age of 50. And we're seeing the impacts of COVID as well on the disabled population in the recent year or so. Evidence in this report showed that certain patients could have got better if they'd received the right treatment or care. There are problems with access to healthcare by people with learning disabilities that often reflect the circumstances in which a person lives. Living in the community means there's no one to keep an eye on basic healthcare needs like personal hygiene, teeth cleaning, and checking dental, making sure people have dental checkup appointments, checking shoes are comfortable, and so on. Evidence gathered from healthcare professionals involved in delivering the health programme at Leicester went so far as to describe this neglect as abuse. In the area of the Games Village giving eye tests, optometrists related that a high proportion of those screens needed spectacles. As some athletes don't read much, some carers didn't think it mattered whether they could see clearly. Similar attitudes prevail regarding hearing, claim audiologists. One athlete was presumed to have a hearing loss, but under examination by an audiologist as part of the screening programme, he was found to have a bead stuck in his ear. Similar stories of neglect were uncovered by podiatrists. Many people with learning disabilities have problems with their feet because of issues relating to disability, low income, and again, neglect. So often they wear trainers all the time and so get sweaty feet, leading to athlete's foot that goes unnoticed. Other problems are caused by wearing hand-me-down or second-hand shoes that don't fit properly. On the positive side, Special Olympics athletes usually have better blood pressure levels than people with learning disabilities who do not take part in sport. This also differs from sport to sport. So, for instance, athletes that take part in bowling have less physical impacts on the cardiovascular system than those that are involved in more vigorous sports. A parent of a young man with cerebral palsy said how, because of his training, his fitness and coordination had improved to such an extent his physical problems were hardly noticeable. Another praised Special Olympics coaching for helping balance. And these are benefits that can be transferred into everyday life when performing daily tasks. The last area of impact is that changes people's lives for the better is that being involved in Special Olympics can give a purpose in life and give confidence and raise self-esteem, as I've already hinted. One parent succinctly put it that the event itself is very important indeed. It gives the athletes a purpose, a sense of purpose rather, and of being. An absolutely fantastic experience. Our youngsters enjoyed the competing as well as the social aspect. It's really done their self-esteem good. They are very proud of their achievements. Another said, there was such a feeling of team spirit. There was no judgment on anybody. This is so important for athletes and families, and it gives such confidence and pride to our young people and adults. The athletes can show off their talents at their own level and feel a real sense of achievement. The fun, companionship, support for each other and pride and pleasure in achievement is an example of an experience some of them rarely get in their everyday lives. It's important to realise Special Olympics aims to give sporting opportunities to those excluded from mainstream sporting competition. It's inclusive and it gives every one of its athletes the chance to be involved in competition. For that reason, the athletes competing, even at international level, may not be the best at that sport. Unlike elite sporting competition, where the aim is to win medals for a nation by sending the best athletes, Special Olympics tries to give as many people as possible a chance to go to the competition. So if an athlete has already won several medals at different World Games, he or she is not likely to be selected again, even if they are still winning in competition. For this reason, I think it's something that always makes me wonder, you know, when you see the same people winning again and again at the Olympics who have got several medals. And I sort of think to myself, well, why don't they just give somebody else a chance if it's such a wonderful thing and spread that that feeling of success. In Leicester, we tried to give the athletes a good experience and had a spectacular opening ceremony at the King Power Stadium. The Prime Minister attended the opening ceremony, and these are all things which boost people's esteem because they can see that it's important and special. Another legacy is that sometimes the athletes do actually get success within the mainstream, and this is a picture of Greg Sylvester, recently honoured with a British Empire Medal. And Greg has trained as a mainstream coach, goes to the gym, does weightlifting, and has represented the UK at several international Special Olympics events at the World Games. And he's also been one of the board members. So he's managed to achieve quite a lot within mainstream life and become public figure. So there are legacies which does help with integration. And so I'm congratulating Greg because I haven't seen him. I've only met him a little while ago. But I think I'll finish there, and you can see that how important Special Olympics is to those involved, even though as an event it's often not covered within the mainstream media, and how important it is to the families as well of those people, and how important it is to recognise the events, to recognise how they have to work all the time with volunteers to be able to put on those important events. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vicky Hope-Walker. I run the National Paralympic Heritage Trust, and thank you for that talk before me. Absolutely fascinating, and actually some real synergy in some of the benefits in the Special Olympics as for the participants in the Paralympics. I'm not going to talk about that. I've got a lecture on that for another occasion. But today I'm just going to talk about how we are documenting the Paralympics at the National Paralympic Heritage Trust. So a little bit about our history, first of all. Can I have the next slide, please? There's a quote here. It's our mission, if you like. We exist to enlighten and inspire future generations by celebrating, cherishing, and bringing the Paralympic heritage to life. Why do we bother doing that? We're a fairly new organisation. We were only formed in 2015 and only got our first funding in 2017. So despite all the wonderful things of London 2012, it was quite a long time before we actually got any legacy to look after all that Paralympic heritage. This is a picture of Hospital Polo. The Paralympics began at Stoke Mandeville Hospital under the guise of Sir Ludwig Guttmann. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And this gentleman was a German Jewish refugee in 1938, a neurosurgeon from Germany. And he was fortunate as a refugee and found work when he came to this country. And he was invited to set up the spinal unit whilst the government were preparing for the D-Day landings and knew there were going to be a lot of spinal injuries. And this is a lovely photograph of Guttmann in front of the Stoke Mandeville Games banner and statement. And that's what the Paralympic Games used to be called, the Stoke Mandeville Games. And it was, if I've ever done one good thing in my medical career, it was to introduce sport into the rehabilitation of disabled people. Next slide, please. So why the importance around looking after this heritage and documenting it? Well, we can't be deemed a museum without having a collection. And without a collection, we can't really share the history and the story. And it's a fantastic history. It's very inspirational. It's something that the country should be hugely proud of. And it's also a really important element of disability history in this country as well. because right from the start, the Paralympics wasn't just about sport and elite sport. It was also about, from Dr. Gutman's point of view, it was about raising awareness of disabled people. It was getting them integrated back into society, to work, to contribute, to go traveling, to be tourists, to live their life as anyone else would live, which seems quite remarkable given attitudes towards disability at the time, that this individual was so driven to change things. And in this picture here, you can see the documentation of the Paralympics has led to, on the upper left-hand side, that is our Heritage Centre at Stoke Mandeville. And then a couple of the pictures on the right-hand side are of regional exhibitions, where it's helping us by going out to regions and doing exhibitions with partners in those regions. It's helping us document local stories. And in fact, the one on the right-hand side is Cartwright Hall in Bradford. And in Bradford, there is a really strong history on the Special Olympics. And we had a whole panel dedicated to that local achievement whilst we were there. Next slide, please. So going back to the theme of this talk, which is all about documenting the Paralympics, in planning this, we had to think very carefully about the history we were working with, the fact it was disability history, and how we were going to gather it and what was out there, what was already out there. So we carried out a couple of scoping research projects, one in 2015 and one in 2016. And that gave us a very good idea of what sporting organisations and what museums had already collected. I have to say it was pretty minimal. There's far more emphasis nowadays on museums collecting things that their local communities can relate to. And sporting heritage is obviously a big part of everyone's life. And I think that those museums and organisations are getting better at collecting it. But in 2015 and 16, there was very little out there. And most of our scoping research actually came down to individuals and individual private collections and their willingness to donate or loan items to us. Next slide, please. So the other difficulty we had, besides trying to find out what was out there and what could be collected and what needed looking after, was expertise. There was very, very little expertise in disability sport history. Most of it, I would say, was related to universities and research work carried out by universities across the country, De Montfort being one of those. But very few individual historians that had any specialism in this area. So in effect, we were all learning the history as we were going forward. In terms of care and conservation, we were presented with some quite unusual items. So, for example, the clothing worn at the opening of the London 2012 Games, some of it was made out of recycled materials like plastic, which deteriorate very easily. So there was quite a range of materials we were faced with, which weren't commonplace in museum collections in terms of conservation and care. We also had a huge range of items, from archive material, mainly paper-based items. That could be the whole, a lot of paper collections from the National Spinal Injuries Centre, where the Games began, through to collections. And then really importantly for this area of history, which is relatively modern history, the opportunity for living and oral histories and how we might collect that to both as items within their own right, but also to complement physical objects and archive paper collections as well. Next slide, please. So this is it was also about developing systems, new systems for how we stored, how we categorized these collections, which were fairly new to museums and archives. And we worked in partnership with Buckingham Museum, which you can see in the photograph here, and also Buckinghamshire Archives. So we worked with them to bring in their expertise for helping to catalogue, or initially box list, all these items. We also worked with the National Archives, who had post-London 2012 taken responsibility for archiving all the government papers on the London 2012 Games development. And then we also work with the Oral History Society in terms of making sure that we were gathering those oral histories in a way that met all the standards. And by standards, I mean, we were aiming to be an accredited museum. Accreditation is really important in terms of your professional status and making sure that you met all the requirements, working at a respected and high level of quality in terms of the work. And here you can see the British Paralympic Association collection, the last of it arriving at the museum for us to be box listing it. Next slide, please. So a collection that is based on disability has to be accessible. It was really, really vital to us that we got this right. And if we didn't, then we were really failing a large part of our audiences. So in terms of accessioning and cataloguing, we had to think about language and how you might search that, those collections. So, for example, if you go into a general collection and you put in the word disabled, you could get all sorts of things coming up. Go and do it, experiment. So, for example, one thing that came up was a disabled tractor, a tractor that no longer worked. So we wanted to get the language right at the start, in terms of how we were recording things, but also made decisions on not changing the language that had been used historically within documentation. It was important to leave that in place. Language that nowadays we might find offensive, but it was the language that was used a number of years ago. The other side for us is physical access. How could we make things accessible? Were people with disabilities interested in our collection? Some of them may not be able to come and visit it. Also, when it came to our displays, how that was accessible. And right at the very start of our work in 2017, we brought in we created a board of 10 people with a whole range of disabilities, including people who had learning needs as well. And they made many, many major decisions for us, and they actually shaped the way that we were doing everything. That said, we didn't get everything right. And one thing I always say to other people when they come to us for advice on accessibility and disability is that don't think you'll get it right, because every individual is an individual, and one person's visual impairment is always completely different to another person's visual impairment. But essentially, it's about remembering we're all born human and never being afraid to ask and never being afraid to learn and to keep on making changes and improvements along the way. Next slide, please. So here's a picture of some of our items in the collection, and then an image on a laptop of the modes, which is one of the systems that our collection is stored on. We have had 635 donations, and some of those donations have been very, very large indeed. We have 32 very, very large boxes with items in that take 2 or 3 people to carry them. We have 10 linear meters of items in storage. We have 2,000 other boxes yet to catalogue, and a very intense programme over the next year to get through those with some additional volunteers and staff. We have recorded 600 oral histories. And as you can see there, we think we're about 1/5 the way through of being catalogued. We've box listed almost everything in our collections now, but the cataloguing is much more in depth and a lot more work to do. And I think it's worth raising actually at this point that many of our volunteers are people with disabilities. A lot of our volunteers are people with autism, levels of autism. And I thought it was very interesting what Susan was saying about the vulnerability of some of these individuals. And we have seen that. We have seen how sometimes their carers, there is a degree of neglect, perhaps in their hygiene and other areas. And these are people who are often very, are very, very capable in terms of supporting our work and being part of our work. But, it's not our role, their day-to-day care, but it's when they are working for us, it is. And I think that brings in the whole thing of safeguarding and our role in safeguarding when you're working in this way, sometimes with vulnerable, what would be deemed as adults at risk of neglect in many cases. Next slide, please. So the issues we've had, costs. Costs aren't an issue if you can do the fundraising for them, and we've been fairly successful. But one of the issues that sporting heritage suffers from is it doesn't actually fit into the traditional funding streams for collections and cataloguing work. And I think that inadvertently, a lot of those funding trusts and charities that you can apply for actually still are embedded in an 18th century concept of what a museum should be, and sporting heritage doesn't really fit neatly into that. So the kind of costs and fundraising has been quite an interesting journey for me. And in the past, working with different collections, I've found it a lot easier. And despite so many funders saying that disability is way up there on their agenda, they really aren't. They might say it's way up there in their policy, but my feeling is that they're not putting their money where their mouth is always. And it's a bit of a bone of contention that through the Sporting Heritage Network we're all facing, and we're pushing at every day. The other area is collecting from the recent games. Every time a games occurs, trying to get collections. And again, people are in the habit, organisations are in the habit of bringing in things to their own organisation, but not necessarily then handing them over to us for their long-term care. So it's been kind of changing habits of some of the sporting governing bodies in terms of, well, we can look after this for you, you can still have access to it, but actually it does need proper care and proper cataloguing. The division of the collections for us, because we're a small organisation and we're working with a museum in terms of the objects and an archive in terms of the paper collections, it's meant we've had to divide things up. But some people's collections contain both, most of them, objects and archive material. So it's been making decisions around that and where things should be kept together, or where things are really vulnerable and it's an item is at risk of being lost because it needs specialist conservation treatment. Then we have made decisions to divide collections, but they both carry with them a shared catalogue number so that they can be searched across both the county museum store and the county archive stores. I've already mentioned expertise and how there was no real one person with particular expertise. And we've drawn on the expertise of many professors from universities, and inadvertently ourselves have become very knowledgeable about the collection as well. And then, you know, I think that the way we've had to set up our systems is quite varied and quite different to some other traditional ways of cataloguing things. And it's been interesting to be able to share those with other organisations. And of course, by cataloguing all of this, we've got far greater display opportunities. When we opened our Heritage Centre in 2019, there was no nice catalogue to go to look at and pull out items that we would put on display. Now we have a much greater idea of what's in the collections, and we would probably do some of our displays slightly differently, and we'll be developing them over the coming year as well. Just on the opportunities side, a collection like this, wonderful for diversifying audiences, diversifying volunteers. It's been obviously the provision of displays and learning material. We've done an awful lot digitally, not because of COVID, but actually in terms of disability access. But when COVID struck, it was meant that we were very well prepared for that. It's led to 2 PhDs, one with De Montfort University itself, and further oral history work, we hope, planned with Coventry. And looking to the future, we're hoping to put some displays on permanent displays up at the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in London, as well as at the moment looking at rescuing one of the original hospital huts that Gutman worked in, which is at risk of being demolished. So lots of exciting opportunities. Final slide, please. So just to finish, really, why are we doing all of this? What's the ultimate value of it? Well, a collection like this is brilliant at challenging negative perceptions of disability. So that's how we use our collection. Not only is it a fantastic story, and you had some statistics in the last presentation, but hate crime towards people with disabilities, particularly people with learning needs, increased substantially after London 2012. I think some of that was because people were more confident to actually report hate crime. But it is possible that things like the welfare cuts that hit shortly afterwards put in a lot of negativity around disability. And the Paralympics is still not on par with in the way it's treated to the Olympics. So there's a way to go to fight for greater equality. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both, Vicky and Sue, for such interesting talks. I was very interested in the overlaps between the two events and the two collections. I was particularly surprised by how moving your talk was, Sue, when you were discussing how positive the sporting activity was for the the isolation, the health, the social life of the participants, and Vicky, you touched on that as well. So obviously sport can play such a very positive role in the lives of people with disabilities, on not just on a physical health level, but on social and mental levels as well, which was a very interesting theme to come out. I don't think we have any questions. If anyone does have a question for Vicky or Sue, please pop them in the chat now. We do have a few minutes where we can ask some questions and have a little discussion. One of the things I was interested in, Vicky, was how you were talking about sort of co-creation and how you had disabled people involved from the very beginning. And so, Sue, did you find that in when you were writing your legacy report that you were bringing in, how did you bring in the voices of the disabled participants? You talked about their families a lot, and I'm interested in how you sort of secured the voices of the participants themselves rather than having their families speak for them.
Yes, I made sure that the people we have to call. We talked about the terminology that was used. And one of the things that we have to do is refer to those that take part as Special Olympics athletes, which, because of the use of the word Olympics within the title, means that the actual Olympic organisation does have some control over the kind of language and things that we can use. So I think I'll clarify that, why I said athletes all the way through it, even when I was talking about times when they weren't necessarily being athletes in their social life outside Special Olympics. One of the things that I did as part of the project was that we interviewed athletes, not just the current athletes, but those that had taken part in the past. So I travelled to different parts of the country and did recorded oral history interviews with some of those that had been involved. Some of them were more able to describe clearly what they remembered. But even from those that struggled with verbal and communication skills, the fact that they were things that they remembered meant that it had an impact on their life. So they were able to describe what it was like winning and being with their friends. And what did come across from what the athletes told me was, especially those that I said were former athletes that used to take part and didn't any longer, it emphasised how little control people with learning disabilities often have over their own lives. So someone would say, oh, they really love being able to go to the leisure centre and swim, or I like to go running. And then I'd say, well, why don't you go anymore? And it would be because the person who had been their carer or a support worker, or if they went to a day centre, as used to happen in the past, which most of them have closed now and aren't there, the person that used to take them was no longer available, or they changed jobs. It often depended on the enthusiasm and skills of the person that was working with them as a carer, whether they got to take part or not. Basically what I'm saying.
Yeah. Vicky, do you find that with the Paralympics, which arguably has a higher perception, higher status, higher visibility perhaps than the Special Olympics, that there's still that barrier for participation? You would think, I mean, recently it's had a lot more presence on television, for example, and it's surprising to you talking about how difficult it's been for you to get funding, when I think that the public probably perceive that something that is, on Channel 4 wall to wall when it's on and so on, that there must be money there, but obviously it's not getting through to securing that legacy.
No, it's exceedingly difficult, actually, and there isn't, it's people with disabilities in general are far less likely to take part in sport. And it's quite hard for them sometimes to find clubs. If they do find clubs, it might be hard to get, Susan said it, transport, all of those things. it's not treated equally. That the Olympics has this overriding power across all of these areas. The Special Olympics, the Paralympics, and actually, if you talk to the individual athletes, it's quite annoying for them. They feel that there should be greater freedom for some of these organisations getting on and doing things. So I think there's a long way to go, personally, and I think that listening to Susan talking about the vulnerability of people and the carers, I think is a really big issue. We lost someone recently who was autistic, who wasn't looking after his health. And it was a death that could have been avoided. So I think there's a complication in the roles that certainly we play as an organisation of it's not just about looking after collection, it's about a role in the lives of the people we're working with and the histories that we're recording. And that's a very serious responsibility.
I was going to say that sounds like quite almost a burden for you as an organisation, where you're starting out as a museum, but then you find that you have this whole other remit, almost an unspoken remit, simply because you're representing such marginalised people. Absolutely, and
our insurance treats us like a care home for the elderly. Even though we don't take, we have very little responsibility. We have some responsibility for adults at risk coming in and doing some volunteering for us, but most people would have a carer with them. But I don't see that as a burden at all, though.
No.
It brings an absolute diversity and joy to our work, and a whole new way of looking upon things. And what better way to challenge negative perceptions of disability by having people like that as your ambassadors and representatives. So really important.
Sue, I was interested in the fact Leicester's hosted twice the Special Olympics. Is it unique for hosting the Special Olympics twice? Is there a reason?
I'm not sure what's been happening since, because with COVID, I've not really been able to find out what's been going on and whether other places have now done that. So something that I need to be able to look at. One of the things which I didn't mention while talking about families was for them, going to the games is important as well, because it can offer a holiday for them. It's a place that they can go and take their disabled son or daughter, or even an adult son or daughter, to take part. So it's like a break. And for those that go without their parents, it's a respite for the parents because they've gone away as well. So it has other social functions which are not necessarily to do with sport or competition. And another thing we have to remember with families is that often the athletes are very dependent on their family, and they rely on lifts and so on. And it's something which perhaps parents that got involved and volunteers that got involved in the 70s are now getting older and finding it difficult themselves and are becoming vulnerable themselves, and have to find some way of making it sustainable and something for them to carry on once they can no longer do it. And the other important thing to remember is if you have a child who is severely disabled, then the parents' own life chances are limited as well, because one of them may have to give up work to become a carer, but hadn't planned to do that. So they could, or they may not be able to take jobs which offer more money because of the need to be available, perhaps at short notice if the child's ill, or they need to take them somewhere. And it's a responsibility that all of us as parents have when our children are small. But if you have a disabled child, it doesn't stop once the child becomes a teenager and more independent, or when they become an adult, and when they might leave home and so on, because those things may not happen for some of those that have got very severely disabled children.
No, quite. Vicky, do you find that the families are very involved in the collections that you hold?
Oh, yes, definitely. And often our first point of liaison might be through a family member, particularly regarding volunteering. And just sharing the stories together, really. But I mean, I think aside from that, one thing that's interesting is that some young people are in families where they haven't got the role models. And actually, our collection provides fantastic role models. And when we did our market research at the beginning, it was made very clear by people with disabilities that they didn't want all the superheroes. They wanted the people who hadn't got a medal. They wanted the people who were the organisers or the volunteers. They wanted those stories as well. So our collection doesn't just focus on, you know, the person who got 12 gold medals. It's much broader than that. And it's very brutally honest at times. It's talking about depression. It's hearing an athlete say, if I could have taken a tablet, I would have done. You know, to end it all, it's, you know, it's about having it's a safe place, a museum, to sometimes have some very difficult conversations and debates. Yeah, so that's really important to us.
Lovely. Well, we have run out of time. It's already 1 o'clock. Thank you both so much for joining us today as part of this UK Disability History Month event. It would be lovely to speak to you again about these subjects. I'm sure we could talk for another hour about all of these things. But thank you both so much for joining. This talk will be available on YouTube to watch again. If anyone if anyone missed it today, then they could come back and please recommend it. But yes, I'm sure all of our audience will join me in thanking you for joining us, and for, you know, your thought-provoking and interesting comments today. Thank you both.